We're continuing our study of Messianic Prophecy today with a look at the book of Daniel. And there are a number of passages we could study in the book of Daniel. In fact, we could spend hours just introducing this topic. But we're going to primarily focus on two key areas. One is the area of the four kingdoms prophesied in the book of Daniel. We find that in chapters 2 and 7, and we'll look primarily at chapter 2 here now. And then the 70 weeks prophecy there in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. A prophecy that many believe is the most, if not one of the most important passages in the entire Old Testament in relation to our study of Messianic prophecy. As we begin our study of the book of Daniel, there are several concerns, what I've called critical concerns, that we need to at least address in coming to understand the nature of the book and how the book of Daniel is treated. There are two primary areas whenever I think of the book of Daniel and the major issues to study. One area has to do with the nature of the end times, teachings of the Bible, millennial schemes relating to the question of perhaps dispensational theology versus amillennial theology, and how to understand what the end of time is there in the book of Daniel, or the time of the end as it's usually expressed. And so what future events will unfold according to the book of Daniel. That's one key area, a very controversial area of discussion. It seems like Daniel 9 is a place where people always refer back to and base some of their eschatology and end times scenarios on what the book of Daniel teaches about that. The other area that we'll just talk about briefly here is in the critical area, because many Bible scholars, students, have argued that the book of Daniel really was not even written by Daniel. And there are many commentaries published today and that have said that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. In fact, critics often cannot agree on much, but one thing they generally do agree on, and that is that they date the book of Daniel to about 165 BC. They do so because of very specific prophecies that the book of Daniel contains, primarily in chapter 11, where a virtual blow-by-blow description is given of events that start with the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. He's called a mighty king there in that text, and taking us down to the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, who persecuted the Jews, tried to stamp out their faith, and that took place in the middle of the 2nd century BC. And along the way there in chapter 11, very detailed descriptions of Antiochus' efforts are given. Liberal critics who do not accept supernatural predictive prophecy will never accept the book of Daniel as being written by the 6th century prophet. But we remember that they do not accept that all of Isaiah was written by Isaiah either, because in chapters 44 and 45 we read about Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus is specifically named in the book of Isaiah. And so critics will not accept that as being by the 8th century prophet Isaiah, when Cyrus lived several centuries later. But this issue of the dating of Daniel certainly affects our understanding of the entire book. And it relates now to our discussion of the four world empires. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel is summoned to interpret the dream after the wise men, the various enchanters and soothsayers, were unable to help Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the special condition that Nebuchadnezzar added there in Daniel 2. It wasn't enough to do what was traditionally done by these so-called wise men. The king would tell them the dream, and then they would come up with the interpretation. This time, Nebuchadnezzar threw a monkey wrench into the thing. He said, "You must not only tell me the interpretation of the dream, but you need to tell me the dream that I dreamt." And the wise men said, "Oh, no one can do that. You're asking the impossible." And finally, they were condemned to be destroyed. And finally, Daniel was summoned to the king, and through the prophecy of Daniel, the various wise men of Babylon were spared. And so this four world empires that Nebuchadnezzar's dream involved is going to be the focus here of our time today. I have given you several things in your materials, and one of those is a chart that relates to the world kingdoms in the book of Daniel. And you can refer to that. Be aware that these four world kingdoms are talked about in several places. Chapter 2 that we'll look at right now. Chapter 7, which has four beasts coming out of the sea. And those beasts correspond to elements of the image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about in chapter 2. In chapter 8, two of those kingdoms are described using different animal imagery there. And even now here in Daniel chapter 9 that we'll look at in connection with the 70 weeks, we have to link that time prophecy with one of these kingdoms. And then throughout chapter 11, the kings of the north and the kings of the south are described. And those also relate to these future world empires that would come on the scene. Well, you remember the story, I think, and I'll just kind of fast forward here to when Daniel basically tells the king what his dream was. And starting in verse 31 of Daniel chapter 2, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. And the head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And you continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands," something of divine origin. "And it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and crushed them. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Now, in the interpretation of this dream, we have these four aspects of the image: the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron. It's made clear that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 37, "You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdoms, the power, the strength, and the glory." Into verse 38, "You are the head of gold. And after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. And then a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces." He describes the feet and the toes, partly of clay, partly of iron, talking about having a mixture there, a division, if you would. The toughness of iron, and yet iron mixed with clay. And so there's a lot of discussion about what exactly that mixture might refer to. But we come down to verse 44, "And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it itself will endure forever. Now, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." For years, critics attacked the book of Daniel's historicity, and several arguments were made in this attack against the book of Daniel. This attack goes really back to the 2nd century. A critic of the Jewish faith named Porphyry argues that the book of Daniel was actually written during the period of the 2nd century. The Maccabees were those Jews that rose up against Antiochus Epiphanes and drove the Greeks out of power. And so sometimes this is referred to as the Maccabean Revolt or the Maccabean period. So you may read about the Maccabean date of the book of Daniel. That's the theory that the book of Daniel was written in connection with this struggle between Antiochus Epiphanes and the Jewish heroes, these Jewish rebels led by Judas Maccabeus. There are several issues that were raised about the book of Daniel. One was the language of the book. Now, half of the book of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic, and the other half is written in Hebrew. Roughly chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. For a time, it was argued that the Aramaic of Daniel is a later version of Aramaic, and therefore it was argued that the 2nd century date fits better. But in more recent years, our growing knowledge of Aramaic language, and there are hundreds of texts that date to the time of the Persian Empire, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the Aramaic of Daniel really has much in common with that period of the history of Aramaic. And in fact, there's several centuries, roughly from 500 to 300 BC, where there's not really that much difference in the Aramaic. It's mostly matters of spelling and style. But what's called Imperial Aramaic, the Aramaic of the Persian Empire, is fairly uniform. And so arguing from language that the book of Daniel is late is not quite as impressive and conclusive as it once was. And in fact, the book of Daniel contains virtually no Greek words at all. Usually works written as late as the 2nd century would contain a number of Greek words. There are 3 musical terms found in chapter 3, but we have learned from various parallels that certain culture terms or terms of trade and economy, and that would also include music and art, culture terms can have a long history. And there was contact between the Greeks and the Persians and the Babylonians centuries before this time. So really the language argument in the book of Daniel favors the earlier date, not the later date. Most of the foreign words in the book of Daniel are Babylonian words and Persian words, which is what you might expect if Daniel lived during the Babylonian Empire and the early years of the Persian Empire. Another argument was the historicity of the book of Daniel, that there were mistakes or that there was simply fiction found in the book. The classic example is Belshazzar, the king, there in Daniel chapter 5. Now, all of Greek history recorded that the last king of Babylon was named Nabonidus, and they all concurred. And yet here we have in the book of Daniel no mention of Nabonidus. Instead, Belshazzar is the king the night that Babylon fell. Now, the Jewish historian Josephus, who, by the way, really regarded the book of Daniel very highly. If the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century, only a couple of centuries before Josephus, he certainly was not aware of that. Daniel was really Josephus' favorite prophet, and Josephus is aware of a number of the prophecies in the book of Daniel. Some he comments on and some he does not. An interesting one that he does not comment on is in chapter 2, where we just read that in the days of those kings, God would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Josephus understood the 4th kingdom here to be Rome, which is what I believe. And Josephus therefore understood that Daniel chapter 2 was prophesying the ultimate destruction of the Roman Empire. Now, in his commentary or his discussion in Antiquities, Josephus does not really go into that interpretation. That would not have been a very wise thing to do in light of the fact that he was living in luxury at the hands of the Roman emperor. And so Josephus just makes a comment about chapter 2 that as far as those verses go, the meaning is pretty obvious, and he just kind of passes on by and doesn't get into interpretation of that. But Daniel understood it as a work written by the prophet. Josephus understood it was a book that was written by the prophet Daniel. A little over 100 years ago, the name Belshazzar was finally discovered, and it's important to realize that this name was discovered on cuneiform clay tablets written in Babylonian from the time of Nabonidus, the fall of Babylon. There's no doubt that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. But in these clay tablets, Nabonidus asks for prayers for himself and for his crown prince, one specific son that is mentioned by Nabonidus. And that crown prince's name is, in Babylonian, Bel-Shar-Utzer. And pretty much everyone understands now that the name Belshazzar is the Hebrew rendition, or in the Aramaic rendition, of Bel-Shar-Utzer. When Babylon fell, Nabonidus was out of the city with the armies, and in his place, Belshazzar was ruling as de facto king. And in fact, Babylonian history tells us that Nabonidus was out of the city for years at a time in various adventures. Some of them may be archaeological. Some view him as an ancient scholar and archaeologist. Some of those archaeological trips may have had certain military strategic value. There's debate about that. But Belshazzar is no longer an embarrassment for the conservative view of the book of Daniel. Instead, it has become an embarrassment for those who would like to date the book to the 2nd century. And so now it is generally argued by those who date the book to 165 BC that in these early chapters of Daniel there is earlier material that has been brought in. And so the name Belshazzar, once an object of ridicule, is now an object of confirmation for the book of Daniel. Josephus didn't know what to do with Belshazzar. He referred to both Nabonidus and Belshazzar and said they were just two names for the same person. For Josephus, it was fourth down and time to punt, and that's the best thing he could do, was equate the two names. Now we know the historical circumstances, and it's very clear that Belshazzar was the crown prince and the son of Nabonidus. Now, as we come to the fulfillment of this prophecy about the four world empires, let's come back to our comment about the dating of the book of Daniel. Critics of the book of Daniel who do not see clear prediction in this book, who seek not to see clear prediction in the book, must then contend that the four kingdoms of Daniel end in the Greek Empire. Now, in the chart I've provided for you, I show you that the first kingdom is Babylon. The second kingdom is Medo-Persia. That's the way the book of Daniel describes the empire. And that is the way that history regards the empire. Daniel chapter 5, verse 28, the handwriting on the wall, the last term there, Peres, the interpretation, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. And so the Medes and the Persians constitute a single power. It was the Medes and the Persians who conquered Babylon together. Medo-Persia as a second empire, Greece as the third empire then, and Rome as the fourth. There are a couple of other indications. If you would look through the chart and look at the various scriptures that describe these empires, there's a two-ness about the Medo-Persian Empire. For example, two arms, silver arms. But even more significant, there in chapter 7 and verse 5, this Medo-Persian Empire is described as a bear, and it says that it was raised up on one side. One side seemed to be predominant. Or, turning over to chapter 8, and everyone agrees that the ram with two horns represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And we're told about this ram with two horns that, verse 3, it says, two horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one coming up last. Media was the primary power initially, and then because of Cyrus the Great and his background, Persia became the ultimate power, the primary power. So the longer horn came up last. A bear hunched on one side, a ram with two horns. Those speak to the twofold nature of this second empire, which I think clearly has to be Medo-Persia. On the other hand, the empire of Greece is described by the number 4. Now, if we go to chapter 8, and again, everyone agrees that the goat with the large horn in chapter 8 is referring to Persia, beginning with Alexander the Great. But in chapter 8, verses 5 through 8, we're told that once the large horn was broken, down at verse 8, it says, as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so this empire in chapter 8 that the goat represents, which is clearly Greece, has this description of fourness attached to it. Now, if we go back to chapter 7, the leopard is the empire following the bear, and this leopard also has this image of 4. In verse 6 of chapter 7, behold another beast, a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And so internally, as you look through the various descriptions of these beasts and kings in the book of Daniel, and by the way, the term king and kingdom sometimes are very difficult to distinguish. It seems that there is a consistent description of the Greek Empire and a consistent description of the Medo-Persian Empire. That leaves us then with the 4th beast being that of Rome. This is the iron beast, and it's ferocious, it's strong, it's fierce. There's no single animal that really can describe this 4th beast. I won't go into the book of Revelation here with you now, but we get into chapter 13, and the beast that comes up out of the sea, that is a single beast that has 4 aspects to it, and there are some parallels perhaps we could make between the 4 beasts of Daniel and the 4-natured beast there in the book of Revelation. Well, one thing that this provides for us, and one reason why this I think is important to discuss in anticipation of our look at the 70 weeks prophecy, is that it seems to me that there is a time element that is involved. And if we take this text at face value, certainly, and the only way that the vision really makes sense is to understand that all 4 empires would have had to have come into existence before this stone, the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, would crush the image and then grow and fill the earth. Talks about becoming a great mountain and filling the entire earth. But the image that it crushes, that it strikes, I think sort of a bowling ball hitting a giant pin here, the image is crushed on the feet. It crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. And so all the elements of this image are in place. That means that all 4 kingdoms have come upon the world scene. That means that this kingdom, I would take it to be the Messianic kingdom, does not come into place until the time of the Roman Empire, that is, the 4th empire here in the book of Daniel. That provides us with somewhat of a time prophecy. It's in the days of the Roman Empire that God is going to set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. I think the contrast is important here. These kingdoms have come and gone. Now, each kingdom sort of takes its predecessor, and we can do a lot of morphing with computers today and change the images of people, give them different heads and bodies, and pretty much do whatever we want to do. But imagine this image then is changing, and the Babylonian Empire is swallowed up by the Medo-Persian Empire. And when that happens, it is enlarged. When the Medo-Persian Empire was swallowed up by Greece, it too was obviously greatly enlarged. And then comes Rome conquering the Greek Empire. So this image, which represents world government and world kingdoms, if you would, is made up of all of these different components. But it's in the time of the 4th empire, the 4th kingdom, that God sets up His eternal kingdom. He describes it as a kingdom that will never be destroyed. He describes it in verse 35 as a statue, a stone that becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. We've discussed about the parallels in Daniel chapter 7, these four beasts. We've looked at some of the other passages in the chart that relate to the kingdoms. It seems to me that, in conclusion, the fourth empire of the book of Daniel is Rome. It's represented in Daniel chapter 2 as these legs of iron and feet of iron and clay. It's represented in chapter 7 as this strong beast, which, by the way, also is made up of iron or possesses iron teeth. And it's in the time of the Roman Empire, then, that the Messianic kingdom will be established. The debate among prophecy students is what phase of the Roman Empire are we discussing here? Modern dispensationalism would argue that Rome will eventually become the revived Roman Empire, or perhaps we are already in the revived Roman Empire, the European Common Market, or the European Union today, and are suggesting that Rome, that today's world government is a modern manifestation of Rome, and so that the beast or the Antichrist or some other term for a figure, a world ruler, will come out of this European Union that exists today. And there are linkages there, obviously, with the Roman Catholic Church as well, and some of the discussions about future phases of what Rome would be. All of that is, I think, based upon the assumption that it's the final phase of the kingdom that is being pointed out here. I would suggest that from the theology of the New Testament, that we can argue that the kingdom is in place now. After all, the kingdom simply depends on the presence of the king, and it's authority and rule, dominion that's important, not territory, not buildings, not borders. And so I think there's a real sense in which the kingdom has been established. Now, it continues to grow, and it continues to fill the whole earth. And I would argue that the four world empires listed in the book of Daniel no longer exist. It is true that someday all world government will be at the feet of Jesus at the throne. And Paul reminds us in Philippians 2 that one day every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. But I don't think that we have to look for a future phase of Rome here in order to accomplish the idea that this promise is fulfilled through the coming of Christ and the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And so that gives us some of the background for a look at the 70 weeks prophecy. Among other things, it shows us that in the book of Daniel there is clearly a delay involved in the coming of the Messiah and the establishing of the Messianic kingdom.